Hi folks, we're Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the French Revolution. Now, there's a lot of history around. I mean, it's a well discussed topic. A lot of history around about the French Revolution, and quite a few of the historians assert, if not insist, that it was a peasant revolution, a peasant revolt, a working class revolt, and something that after was well underway, the bourgeoisie, or the petty bourgeoisie in particular, even some of the big bourgeoisie, or the grand bourgeoisie, as they say in France, jumped on the bandwagon and sort of hijacked it, or part of it. Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, was minor provincial nobility. He wasn't one of the big heavy hitters in the aristocracy. Nonetheless, let's just examine this idea that it was a working class revolution. Now, you can debate whether it was or not. I'm not so sure it was, but what I try and look at in history, and this was actually encouraged by a teacher I had in like year 10 or something at high school, to look at the logical sequence in history to see if it stacks up, and then to come back to the narrative that any particular historian is spinning, and if you see an inconsistency, go back again, read more widely, this sort of thing. And it was something that sort of once he mentioned that, I remember sort of the penny dropping, thinking, he's got a point there, and it encouraged me to look at history in a different way, really from that point onwards. And at the time I was, 14 or 15 or something. So, and I did a recent video on Alexander the Great, and in certainly the history that remains, written by the victors, one assumes, but certainly in the history that remains of the great battles of Alexander the Great, where you've got 30 or 40,000 soldiers on either side, so you've got like 80,000 troops on the battlefield, that Alexander was able to win the day, win the battle with 100 or so, or 200 or so casualties. So we're supposed to believe that the Persians, having quite well prepared defensive positions, with lots of archers and slingers and goodness knows what, that Alexander's massed phalanx troops were able to, in formation, cross an embankment, a slow, a moving river, and walk through waist deep water and this sort of thing. And thousands were able to do that and suffer only a handful of casualties while arrows are raining down on them. I mean, that's just not possible. So I was able to look at that and say that this probably isn't an accurate depiction of what actually happened, unless there are other factors involved. And I mentioned this in the video. Maybe the other side was many of the key soldiers were bribed, so they, as soon as the battle began and before the first sort of shot had been fired, if you like, that half the troops abandoned the battlefield from the Persians, and then the rest just ran away, and so a few stragglers got killed, and that was it. Those were possibilities which I mentioned. But on the French Revolution side, it was supposed to believe that that inflammatory leaflets and pamphlets and newspapers were being handed out to the working class, to the peasants on the street. And because there'd been some pretty poor harvests recently, the numbers of peasants in the city had swelled to unusually high levels, and because food supply was also a problem in the city, but particularly price inflation on things like bread and flour and grain and so on, that this is the torch, if you like, the spark that set off the French Revolution, or the final straw that broke the camel's back, as it were. So the claims in the history, certainly that I've read, and I've got one here, which is actually quite a good one. It's I'm looking at it now. It's by Christopher Hibbert. It's called The French Revolution. It's by Penguin, and it's pretty good. And I've got plenty of others as well, but that's the one sort of sitting right in front of me this very minute. But so reading through the various histories, not just this, but various histories, we're supposed to believe that workers, peasants from the rural areas who would have been illiterate, they were somehow voraciously reading and consuming inflammatory pamphlets about how evil the aristocracy was, or the evils of King Louis and Marie Antoinette and so on, and this drove them to feverish levels of revolutionary fervor, and then they were getting together and singing revolutionary songs that had only just been written, so the words to the songs were being handed out so the peasants could read them, and this was all part of the wider the masses getting stirred up and getting okay. So let's assume that was the case, that these radical pamphleteers are really whipping up the crowd, whipping up the masses into a hysterical state. Maybe it was, but let's look at the logic of this. In order for these pamphlets to have traction and have the effect they had, then there would have to be a lot of literate people who could read. Now, the majority of people that were churning out these pamphlets were former government employees, lawyers, this sort of thing. So they would have been literate. They'd have had the whole school education, college. They'd have had the whole thing. But there's only a very small number of those around. So who exactly was consuming the pamphlets they were putting in? And if you look at the language they used, it was very flowery. Sure, it was inflammatory, but very flowery as well. The prose and the way they structured the wording, and the words they used, how big the words were. These were words that most people would never use and had never used. So how many people could understand these pamphlets? So we'll look at the literacy. Now, the supposed literacy at the time was about 30% of the overall population, with heavily overrepresented were the aristocrats, of course, the clergy and government officials. So now, when you take them away, that there's less than 10% of the, in fact, somewhere around 5% of the population outside of those classes, like the clergy and so on, school teachers and the like. A very small number of people are actually literate. But let's even go further here. Let's look at the definition at the time. So we're talking about 1790s here. What was the definition of literacy? Well, literacy meant that you could sign your name. And a vocabulary of 20 words was considered as literate. So the literate, and nor was literacy as in you understood the alphabet, your ABCs, you could form words, understand them, understand how the alphabet and the sequence of letters created words. These were rote learned things. So say for example, you're a provincial baker or a baker, you're baking bread. Now you would know the word bread, but you would recognize it as one symbol. You wouldn't recognize as B-R-E-A-D. You wouldn't recognize the letters there. You would I know that symbol, that means bread. So it would be a symbolic understanding rather than what we would call today a literate understanding. So people could read the word bread, or they could read the word or see the symbol flour or grain or oven, so they'd have a very small. So that was considered as literate in the day. That was so you're signing your name and having a vocabulary of 10 or 20 words that, again, you would only recognize as symbols, not as words. So this wasn't literacy at all. These aren't the people that were consuming these inflammatory pamphlets, revolutionary type pamphlets. So if the crowd was being whipped up, the mob was being whipped up by this, they certainly weren't doing the reading, because there would be a tiny number of them. Even if there was 1 in 100 of the peasants could have that level of literacy where they could read these pamphlets, that would be it. Now, a second possibility is that there were, if you like, professional readers that would get up on the vegetable crate or something, would stand up and then read these pamphlets out to the crowd. Those capable of excitable turn of phrase would have been, as in storytellers or fable tellers, would have been the ones. But there's no mention of that. No, I'm sure those people did exist. We're talking pre-mobile phones and pre-electronic communications here. So the idea of the town crier that would get up and explain things or make announcements. So those people must have been around. But there isn't any mention of it, that they somehow were part of the whipping up the mob and creating the frenzy. So these pamphlets and newspapers that were going around can't have been what was stirring up the crowds. Too few people were literate, and if there were agitators, then they were in fear of their lives, because they would typically, if you were a known agitator, typically you'd be chased down and arrested and taken back and shot and so on. So we're talking about something else. Was it, in fact, a working class peasant revolution at all? Now, these people were hungry, and the price of bread was high, and they were certainly annoyed and wanted to do, why aren't you doing something about it? Why aren't you fixing this problem? So there was definitely that there. But in terms of the inflammatory political considerations, the equality and fraternity and all this sort of thing that was part of the French Revolution, those aren't the sort of things that the peasants were talking about. They're talking about, look, we don't give a fuck about all that. We want bread. We want affordable bread. We're hungry. That was their issue. So the communists and the Marxists in Karl Marx and all the people in and around him, even the Hegels and from on there would talk about these sort of sentiments that are very much a middle class thing, or petit bourgeois, or people who have an education but feel that they don't have a seat at the table. We've got the education, we've got the skills, we've got the experience, but we can't get a seat at the table in a society that's racked by aristocratic pretensions. They were really, or were they really, the revolutionaries, and the mob was just sort of tagging along. They were the ones getting up and saying, hey, we'll fix this problem with expensive bread. So follow us, and by the way, go over there and kill those people for us. So, was that if you look at the committees for public safety, the Robespierres, the Mirabeaus, the Marets, all the people that were part of the Jacobin side of things, they were all the petty bourgeois radicals. They were the ones that were driving the revolution and were being consumed by it. So when we look at the French Revolution, and it was cited again, by varying the communists, the Marxists, and the Bolsheviks later on, they referred back to the French Revolution. This was where the workers rose up and taught those aristocrats a lesson. And the Bolsheviks really did the same thing. They try to portray the Bolshevik Revolution of where the workers ran into the palace of the Tsar and they kicked those aristocrats out and ushered in a workers' paradise. That wasn't how it was. The leading lights and the main agitators, stirrers, and troublemakers of the Bolshevik side, or even the initial revolution after the Tsar abdicated in Russia in 1917, the likes of the Kerensky and the people around. These were all, many of them were lawyers, provincial lawyers, petty officials, if you like, members of a nascent middle class and so on, but workers, and they were not. And again, illiteracy was so widespread that you couldn't have communicated to them through the written word. The spoken word, sure, but not the written word. The spoken word in the French Revolution was also dangerous, because you got up with a crowd and started speaking, somebody would inform on you and your name would be taken down, and next thing you know, you'd have the police or some sort of, whether it be the revolutionary police or anything else, knocking on your door. So I just want to lay that out, because the French Revolution, certainly on closer inspection, was not a working class or peasant revolution. It was a petty bourgeois revolution by petty bourgeois. We could today call them the approximation of the middle class radicals. And they were the ones that were really behind, I think, the reign of terror and the wanton guillotining of people without any due legal process and so on. I don't think the peasants were that bloodthirsty when they were ginned up and jacked up by revolutionary fervour of these middle class people. Some of them would have gone along with it. The cheering, for example, when Marie Antoinette's head was cut off, and the guillotine, or even the king. And this is a very radical step. That you would kill Louis XVI. I kind of get that. He's the French king. But Marie Antoinette was brought in from Austria. They should have just expelled her or something. What did they need to kill her, for goodness sakes? So that's my take on that. There just simply weren't enough literate people around among the peasant class to be able to consume the radical propaganda of the day. So by extension, I will assert it was impossible to believe that the French Revolution was a peasant or working class revolution. You've been a Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.